Hi, I'm Cheryl Kagan, very proud to be the senator for Gaithersburg and Rockville. Welcome to this week's edition of Kibbitzing with Kagan, where I have brief conversations with people I find fascinating. Surely you are interested in watching today because my very special guest is our awesome U.S. Senator, Chris Van Hollen. Senator Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to chat.
Cheryl, it's great to be with you on Kibbitzing with Kagan, and thank you for all your great leadership over so many years and for your friendship. It's good to be with you.
Thank you. Absolutely. So I have a million things I want to talk to you about, and we don't want to be here all day. But I do want to start with the fact that you were born and lived much of your childhood abroad. You were born in Karachi, Pakistan, and right now Pakistan is in the news. So I thought you might like to start talking briefly about your childhood abroad with a foreign service family, but especially what's going on and the challenges that people in Pakistan are facing.
Sure. You know, my dad was born in Baltimore City, but then he went into the United States Navy, and then he went into the Foreign Service. Met my mom, who was the daughter of an English teacher who became a Russian language expert. And anyway, they teamed up. And so I grew up in many of my early years overseas, although always coming home in between, and born in Karachi, lived in India, Turkey, Sri Lanka, and of course, Pakistan. And you're right, we are witnessing terrible flooding with well over 1,000 lives lost. And this is the most awful and vivid example right now in the world of the devastation of climate change.
Yes.
And why it is essential that we in the United States do our part, and that we also do what we can right now to provide humanitarian assistance to the people of Pakistan.
Yes, and we are going to come back to climate and many issues, but let's talk a little bit about your incredible career. So, law degree, Harvard Public Policy, Swarthmore undergrad, worked for Senator Mathias, great Senator Mathias, William Donald Schaefer, and many others. You ran for the House of Delegates, served a term there, and then 2 terms as a state senator. So why don't you talk about state government and your experience at state government?
Well, my experience was that state government is a place where you can get an awful lot of good things done, as you have during your time in the state Senate. And I really enjoyed my time in both the House of Delegates and the State Senate. The State Senate, of course, has 47 senators. And so because of that smaller size, you know, you really have a chance to talk to everybody and try to persuade them
Yes.
Of the virtues of your legislation, and can, again, be a very productive place, and a place where a lot of, I think, important relationships can be formed, and across the aisle. Democrats and Republicans working with one another. So it was
like it is on Capitol Hill, right?
Yeah, well, you're right. Contrast that obviously draws a clear contrast.
Yeah.
I will say in the United States Senate, you know, I formed some very good working relationships with a lot of my colleagues, but there's no doubt that the national political environment is more polarized than any time in my lifetime and yours. And I do think that is the biggest challenge for our country going forward, finding a way to somehow bring people together.
Agreed. So before we go to the federal government, tell me your favorite Mike Miller story. President Miller, the late President Miller, was the longest serving Senate president in not just Maryland's history, but in the nation's history. And he was a real character. Why don't you share briefly a quick story about Mike?
Well, I can give you one legislative story and then one quick personal story, which is on the legislative side. You know, Mike Miller and I had our differences on lots of issues. I fought hard for a tobacco tax, and he represented Southern Maryland, which was still kind of weaning itself off of the tobacco economy. So, you know, we went to battle. And what I learned about Mike Miller is, you know, he respected people who stood up for what they believed, even if they had different views than he did. I had the same experience on our fight over public funding for some of our football stadiums.
Yep.
On the personal side, I will confess that we often had a poker game, and Mike Miller was a good poker player, and I introduced this game called Guts that I learned up in Alaska when I worked in fish processing factories. So Sometimes he cleaned up the table, sometimes we did, but it was always a good game. He was also a great historian, as you know, Cheryl, a great custodian of Maryland's stories and our place in American history. I have a lot more to tell.
Of course. Well, we want to spend most of our time talking about Capitol Hill, but you had defeated your state senator to be elected to the state Senate. And once again, you were a giant slayer, and you defeated the incumbent member of Congress to head to the U.S. Congress, where you served 7 terms. What did you talk about U.S. Congress and then the transition to the U.S. Senate?
Sure. And let me just a brief story on the state Senate, because it's a funny story with Mike Miller as well, because I was running against an incumbent state senator, and Mike Miller, as was his custom, was loyal to all his incumbent members.
Yes.
I knew I was doing well when about 5 days out from the election, I got a phone call from Mike Miller asking if I would get together with him, which I did, although I said, why would I want to do that since you're working hard to defeat me? But I knew I must be doing well. I couldn't afford polling. I thought I must be doing well when he asked me what committee I wanted to serve on. So
that's amazing.
But from there, you're right. I went to serve in the House of Representatives, and the House was a great place to serve. In the House, it makes a big difference in terms of your ability to get things done in the House as to whether you're in the majority or not.
Yes.
I tried to team up whenever I could with Republicans when I was in the minority, but I had the privilege of serving in the Democratic leadership during my time in the House, and worked very closely with Speaker Pelosi in passing, some of the really important bills, the Affordable Care Act, the banking reform, Wall Street reform bill. And again, the House is a place where if you are in the majority and you can corral your votes, you can get things done, and very quickly, much more quickly than the United States Senate, once you got the votes.
Right. So let's go through a bunch of issues. There's so many issues that you are known for, your leadership that you have worked on for decades now. Let's start with public education. And you were such an important leader on that in Annapolis and have continued. Let's talk about our public schools.
Well, thank you for your leadership on this issue. And I do think it is sort of the ground, the baseline foundation for our success as a state and in the country. And that's why in the state legislature, I really pursued full funding for education and mandatory funding for education in the state of Maryland. And we have worked successfully to increase federal funding for our schools. But I'm still pushing to pass a bill that would do at the federal level what we were able to do at the state level, which is make funding for education mandatory. Because if you look at the gap between what we say we need as a country, what we authorize for education, and what we actually provide, there's this huge gap. And so I'm trying to close that gap by requiring the federal government to do what it says it should be doing and promise. So we got a lot more work to do there. But again, thank you to the state of Maryland and your leadership on that front.
Thank you. Infrastructure. You guys took enormous action on infrastructure, and obviously virtually everything that happens of significance with infrastructure at the local level depends on federal funding. So whether it's the Purple Line or the Hogan proposal that's pending still, and we're hoping to slow it down and change it, about widening 270 and adding toll lanes and all that. Talk about the federal role and the huge infrastructure plan that you guys passed.
This was a huge success story, in my view. We passed it in the fall of last year. What it means for the state of Maryland is an additional $8 billion over the next 5 years, guaranteed in formula funding. And as you know, those are monies where the state determines the priorities in consultation with all of you in the state legislature. But that means, more funds to modernize everything from roads to bridges to transit.
Yes.
Also a component to build out and accelerate high-speed internet and broadband. So this is a very big deal. And on top of the $8 billion that will definitely come to Maryland as part of a formula fund, there are also tens of billions of dollars of other programs where Maryland can compete, and counties and municipalities and others can compete, and look forward to working with you to make sure that we are organized to be in the best position for our communities in our state.
Absolutely. Now, the infrastructure bill passed 69-30, pretty bipartisan, and but not everything has been that. So let's talk about voting rights and election law, which you and I have worked on for a long time.
Yeah. So very briefly, we were able to get some other important bipartisan initiatives through an important veterans health bill, which I should just mention for veterans who are exposed to toxins.
Yes.
It's overseas. We also passed a major bill to bring more high-tech manufacturing back home, especially in the vital semiconductor area, and to expand our investment in research, everything from quantum computing to artificial intelligence and other things. So the United States could really be at, the razor's edge on the sharp edge in terms of competing.
Yes.
But you're absolutely right. One of the things we were not able to get done because we could not get Republicans on board was these very important bills to protect our democracy. One was called the John Lewis Act. The other was the Freedom to Vote Act. And the idea was to set up national standards for fair voting. Every state would have to comply with certain early voting requirements, with certain registration requirements, so that citizens can really exercise their vote without impediments. And as you know, many states have worked to put up more hurdles to voting, trying to win by subtraction.
Yes.
Addition. Thank you for your efforts in Maryland to try to expedite our ability to count votes. I was very sorry that the governor vetoed that
Me too.
legislation. We hope to, get your bill passed going forward.
We will pass it next year. And in the meantime, we're hoping that the circuit court will enable us to start counting votes early.
Yes.
Another issue, Senator, that you have been working on for too long and is still not addressed is gun violence. Why don't you talk about what you think is possible to try to keep kids in Uvalde and in Rockville and everywhere around the country safe?
Yes, and I want to mention in context of the last question, but also this one, Senate procedure, because it goes directly to our ability to get things done. We have a procedure in the Senate on people know it as the filibuster, but what it is, a supermajority requirement, nowhere to be found in our Constitution, that says in order to get to a final vote, you need 60 out of 100 senators, which is just undemocratic, small d. So I'm very much in favor of changing that. If we had changed that, if we had the votes to change it, we could have passed the democracy bills that we just talked about, because we did have all 50 senators, Democratic senators, on board for that. We did not have all 50 on board for changing that rule, but we got to change that rule. And if that rule were changed, we could also have passed much more meaningful gun safety legislation.
Yep.
I was pleased that we took a step forward. It was meaningful, but it was not nearly enough at the federal level. Maryland is way ahead of us, but Maryland's not an island. And if you look at the guns used in crimes in Maryland, majority of them come from out of state, especially in places like in Baltimore City, but also large amounts in other parts of our state. That's why we need a national solution, and we need to adopt some of the things Maryland does, banning semi-automatic assault weapons, universal background checks. We have more than 50 votes today to do universal background checks, but because of the filibuster, we're not able to get that up for a final vote. So that what sounds like just procedure has a huge substantive impact.
No question. And I'm glad filibuster was on the list, but thank you for covering that. One place where Maryland is unfortunately too much of an island is in abortion rights, with so many states levying just ridiculous barriers and burdens and outlawing women's reproductive choice, even in cases of rape, incest, and their lives at stake. Why don't you talk about, again, sort of how Maryland is versus the rest of the country and what's possible?
Well, you're right. Maryland has been a very progressive state. Thank you for your continuing leadership on this. When very first race I ran for the Maryland House of Delegates, I ran on the choice team. This is dating me back to 1990. And Cheryl, at that time, there was a real threat that the Supreme Court at the time was going to overturn Roe v. Wade. At the end of the day, that did not happen. But because of the real threat,
Mhm.
I campaigned on a platform to change Maryland law, which
Yes.
at that time was very restrictive with respect to reproductive rights. And one of the very first things I did as a new member of the Maryland House of Delegates was pass that Maryland law codifying Roe v. Wade
Mhm.
for Maryland women. But as you said, while we have that state law in place, the Supreme Court has now overturned those protections for women in all those states that are moving to outlaw abortion, even in the cases of rape and incest. And this is an extremist turn. It was part of a long-term strategy that Mitch McConnell Republicans had with respect to stacking the Supreme Court. So we have a lot of work to do. First and foremost, what we should do is pass what's called the Women's Health Protection Act at the federal level. The House of Representatives has done it. We've tried to get it up in the state Senate to pass. It would codify Roe v. Wade nationally. But again, the filibuster is the main impediment to getting that done right now.
Yes. Yes. Well, thank you for your consistent leadership on behalf of women's rights, women's reproductive rights. It's so important, Chris, and thank you for your consistency and your principled
Well,
leadership.
we've just got to, there are women throughout the country who are waking up each day as more and more states pass these restrictive laws, who are denied the, right to choose. And so we've got to help them in the near term, those who are looking for alternatives outside the states, but the best long-term solution is a national law protecting reproductive rights.
Amen. Another issue where you've been such an extraordinary leader is where we started this conversation, which is climate change and the climate crisis. Why don't you talk about some of your top priority goals, how we can make a difference?
Well, you're right. This has been a long time effort. And again, Maryland's a leader, and thank you for your efforts at the state level. When I was in the Maryland legislature, we actually passed a number of laws that put, Maryland at the forefront of this effort. And you've continued, those to carry that torch.
We got to give a shout out to my chairman, Paul Pinsky, who's really at the forefront, and my delegate, Kumar Barve, the chair. We've had a lot of great.
Great effort. The Maryland legislature.
Yes.
Collectively has been a leader and put Maryland at the forefront of this. And we're trying to catch up at the federal level.
Yes.
You're right. For years, I pushed for a number of measures, but what the Inflation Reduction Act shows is that if you stick with it for a long period of time, sometimes you can get these things over the finish line. And I worked hard to create what we call a green bank, a national climate bank. And we have the framework for that. We have $28 billion in the bill to help finance that clean energy accelerator and also help a lot of the communities who have been left behind. Another important measure we had called Hope for Homes, which will provide rebates to homeowners who want to make their homes more energy efficient, put on solar panels. And we have rebates that, increase based on income so that lower income families will be able to access these funds. So those were all important parts of it. The bill's not everything we wanted, but it's estimated we'll get to reduce our carbon emissions by 40% by 2030. Our goal is 50%. And as you know, our goal is net zero by 2050. So we talked about Pakistan. We also have the situation in communities around the Chesapeake Bay throughout our country. Cost is very real. It's here and now, but the opportunities for doing something about it are great. And I should mention that does include 2 big offshore wind projects. State of Maryland that are also bringing with them lots of good paying jobs.
Yes. And as you know, I'm trying to establish a revolving loan fund for nonprofits to put solar panels or geothermal, pay back the loans with the money they save, and let nonprofit organizations be part of the solution. So that's exciting. Ukraine. Foreign policy has always been in your heart and part of your enormous expertise. There are about 20,000 Marylanders of Ukrainian descent. How can you reassure them that this is going to end soon and well?
Well, I've been in regular contact with our Ukrainian community, Ukrainian American community, and I just want to thank them for, you know, all that they've done to support the Ukrainian people, and we are partners with them in that effort. Look, this is one of the big, you know, fights of our lifetime when it comes to you know, the forces of democracy versus the forces of authoritarianism. And
Yes.
Vladimir Putin has got to go down in history as somebody who made a huge miscalculation when he thought that he could stamp out freedom and democracy in Ukraine. So our strategy has been twofold. One, to provide the Ukrainian people with all the military support they need. And second, to impose very punishing sanctions on Russia, which have been successful to some extent. And I'm working with some of my colleagues to try to make them even more successful going forward, especially trying to, you know, prevent Russian oil from continuing to be a piggy bank for Vladimir Putin.
Yes. So I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about Donald Trump because I'm just done, except we're not done. So can you, to the degree that you would like to share, your experience on January 6th and your thoughts about possibly nuclear secrets and certainly top secret classified documents found in Mar-a-Lago?
Well, you're right. We're not done, and that's because Donald Trump is not done trying to undermine our democracy, trying to, you know, make the specious claim that he won the last election. He, of course, was the architect of January 6th. That was an awful day for our country, for those of us who were on Capitol Hill. Clearly, it was a traumatic moment, personally, but really most of all for the future of our democracy. I was actually in the House where they started to count the votes from the Electoral College. They got to the state of Arizona, and as you'll recall, that vote was challenged by House Republican members and U.S. senators. So I walked back to my office to pick up my papers because I was scheduled to speak on the Senate floor against this challenge to the Arizona vote. And when I headed back from my office to Capitol Hill, the guards at the underground subway here stopped the senator. You know, there's been an attack on the Capitol. There's a riot. You can't head down there. So I went to shelter in place with my team, kept in contact with folks, watched the awful attack on the Capitol. But I will say, Cheryl, that we were all determined to make sure that we did not allow that attack to stop us from going back, no matter how long we had to stay here during the night. And we did. We all went back, passed those votes. But you're right. The poison of Donald Trump remains with us. And of course, he continues to think he's above the law. And obviously, the fact that he's got these very highly classified, including the most classified documents at Mar-a-Lago, is just an indication of his contempt for the rule of law. And so no one should politicize the law, but no one is above the law.
Right.
And that is what the Biden Justice Department is all about: fair application of the law. So we'll see where this takes us. But we all have to, as citizens, and I appeal to people of all parties, to come together to protect our democracy. And I say that as somebody who worked years ago in the 1980s for a liberal Republican senator from Maryland, Mac Mathias, who always stood up for the rule of law and would be appalled at what's happened to the Republican Party under Donald Trump.
Absolutely. Before we leave this, I just have to give a shout out to our own Jamie Raskin. His book, if you really want to learn more from the inside as the impeachment manager and all that, his book is super compelling and dramatic and heartbreaking. So,
well, and Jamie, of course,
Congressman Jamie Raskin, sorry.
Right. Congressman Raskin, of course, undertook that impeachment trial under the toughest personal circumstances after the loss of his son.
Yes.
And he made a masterful argument as to why the country was endangered by Donald Trump's presidency. And, I only wish we had had more Republican senators willing to stand up for the country over a party.
Agreed. Agreed. One more downer question, then we'll go back to better, happier questions, and then we'll start to wrap up. Downer question. In May, you had a mini stroke and you were obviously fine and doing great, but can you just reassure Marylanders that you are
Yes.
super healthy again and all that?
I am, thanks. Have a clean bill of health, 100% back. But one of the lessons I learned is if you're feeling really weird, you should check yourself in to the hospital and let them check you out. I was giving a speech in Western Maryland and I began to get lightheaded. I had this sort of pain in my neck area. My ears popped a little, and I kept going with my speech pretty good. I think it's on YouTube somewhere. But after that, I said to my team, I'm feeling pretty lousy. And then I had nausea. So long story short, your body's trying to tell you something if it's really doing things that are out of the ordinary. But I'm pleased to have had a full and complete recovery.
Yes. Okay. Happier stuff. What is the federal legislation that you've passed, that you've sponsored or been a big part of that you're proudest of?
Well, that's hard because I have had the ability to be involved in lots of big pieces of legislation. So when I was in the House and part of the House leadership team, I was very instrumental in a lot of the pieces, the Affordable Care Act, which is, providing more affordable care to millions of people around the country and hundreds of thousands of Marylanders. Also very proud of a number of bills passed on the Chesapeake Bay to protect our beautiful Chesapeake Bay, a national treasure. And I will say more recently, these two big pieces that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act regarding climate change are things that I've helped, I've introduced, authored a long time ago. And it is an example of, if you keep at it, you can get something for the finish line. I should also say the negotiating for prescription drugs, finally giving Medicare the authority to do that, is something I've championed for many years. So it is hard to pick one thing, as I'm sure you experienced, but those are some of the big things. Lots of other issues that are very Maryland specific in terms of funding priorities in our state, obviously are things that I'm proud of as well.
Yeah, you are a total rock star and we are so proud of you, but you are not the only impressive person in your family. Give a super brief shout out to Catherine and your kids.
Well, look, our kids are terrific. Our oldest daughter, Anna, was born in August of 1990, shortly before I went my first Democratic primary for the House of Delegates. And so all of them had their teeth cut a little bit on but are probably glad to have a lot of that behind them. But they're all very active, engaged citizens. And my wife, Catherine, is a partner in every sense of the word. We share the same values as well as obviously, a great loving relationship. So, but you're right. I'm glad you asked about family because really that does help sustain all of us and couldn't do it without them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Is there anything I haven't asked you about that you want to share here?
No, I think you covered it very well. And I tried to keep it moving here.
Good.
But I think I will just go back to that question you had about where we are in terms of our democracy, because we are coming up on an important election for the country. And, thank goodness 80 million plus Americans that came out in the last presidential election to help end our national nightmare, at least as it existed in the White House.
Yes.
But this battle for the heart and soul of America, as Joe Biden said, is ongoing, and it's very much on the ballot in November as well. So I just encourage everybody of all parties to get out and please, realize what's at stake here for our country.
It seems like we just need to talk briefly before we go to the Fast Five about the hate and division that was sown by President Trump, and what's the exit of that? How does that ever get addressed? the anti-Semitism, the racism, the homophobia, the anti-Asian violence, it's everywhere and it's awful.
Yeah. Yeah, you remember when he first came down that escalator at Trump Towers. From that very moment, his strategy was to raise himself up
Mhm.
by dragging other people down, right?
Mhm.
By pitting Americans against one another, rather than uniting us. And, the great thing about America over the arc of our history has been, as imperfect as we are, we have traveled over time toward a more perfect union. And Donald Trump, wanted to drag us backwards. So I think at the end, it's up to all of us as Americans to recognize, what this country's about, which is that, people from all faiths, all backgrounds should be able to come here and make it in America and be judged, as Dr. King said, by the content of the character, not by the color of their skin or their religion or anything else. So that is what America is all about. Donald Trump is about the opposite.
Mhm.
So that is why I call upon all Americans, regardless of party, really to unite. We can disagree over lots of things, right? We
Right.
can disagree over tax policy. We can disagree over aspects of all sorts of policies, but we should agree on that fundamental idea of who we are as Americans.
Amen. Amen. So U.S. Senator Chris Van Hollen, fast five quick questions, 5 quick answers. First, who is a former U.S. Senator? I'm not going to ask you to pick from among your colleagues. Who is a former U.S. Senator, dead or alive, that you especially admire?
Well, that would be Mac Mathias, who I worked for, who I think was a really great example of a senator with great integrity, and somebody who was a good role model.
Fantastic. Question 2, you've traveled a lot. Where have you never been that you would enjoy going on vacation? Another country?
Well, I've traveled a lot, but there are a lot of places I still want to go. I'd like to go to Madagascar. I'd like to go to, I've been to a number of countries throughout Africa, but there are a lot I haven't been to. I've never been to Indonesia, Malaysia. So a lot of places still to travel.
All right. Maryland is often described as America in miniature. What 3 words would you use to describe Maryland to your colleagues?
Well, it's interesting you say that, because that's how I do describe it just the other day. And because we are a microcosm of America. And if you look at our geography, right, from the Eastern Shore to the mountains of Western Maryland, and then from Baltimore City to the Washington suburbs in Southern Maryland, we really are geographically diverse, and we have an incredibly diverse population to match. And we are, we have a great history, of course, right? We're the place where George Washington resigned his military commission, something Donald Trump needed to realize, the transfer of power, at least, and of course, where, the Star-Spangled Banner was born in Baltimore Harbor, and we're the home of Frederick Douglass, home of Harriet Tubman, home of Thurgood Marshall. Anyway, Maryland is a great state, very proud of it. And, we've got to make sure that we continue to tell our great history.
Agreed. Question number 4.
I should also crabs, oysters, and lots of good locally brewed beer.
I was just going to say beer. I was hoping you were going to say beer. All right, good job. Question 4. What advice would you give to a young person who's thinking about going into politics or policy?
I'm a big believer that, follow your passion, what you believe in, and, work hard. We can all change. We, all can contribute to changing our community or country in many different ways, in the nonprofit sector, in the business sector. But if you want to pursue a career in public policy and politics, I urge people to get involved in and through internships. One of the changes I was made, you talked about things big and small. My legislation created the paid internship program on Capitol Hill in the United States Senate, because I want to make sure that, everybody, regardless of income, could have that experience. So look, I encourage people to pursue their passions. In my view, the way to approach this is I want to change things, and I see politics as a way to change things, rather than say, hey, I want to be in politics, let me figure out what I believe in.
Yes.
but I do think that, people need to jump in, get involved,
Yes.
get involved in campaigns, get involved in these issues that you care about.
Yes. And you were kind enough to hire one of my high school interns as a U.S. Senate page, and he had a life-changing experience. And so thank you for that role modeling and leadership. The last question, question 5, Senator Van Hollen, what is your hidden secret superpower? What is something you're really good at, a skill or talent that you have, something most folks can't do?
Oh my goodness. Well, I'm a pretty good poker player. I don't think people realize that, but I will say I'm also I do believe in keeping things in perspective and taking risks for various purposes. So
Yes.
I did ride a motorcycle for many years, although wear a helmet.
Good.
And I rode one from Alaska to Washington State. I believe in travel. I don't know about any of these are superpowers, but anyway, if I shared it with you, Cheryl, it wouldn't be my secret superpower.
Well, Senator Van Hollen, thank you for your brilliance, for your leadership, for your dedication to service, for your incredible career. And I also have to give a shout out to your staff and your family, the sacrifices and the commitment that they make. But your staff is known for casework and solving people's problems, and you are so accessible. And I'm just a great admirer and a cheerleader and a friend. So thank you for taking time to chat with me today.
Well, thank you. And thank you for mentioning my staff. We are big believers in making sure we treat all Marylanders like they're members of our family when they're calling with a constituent issue, because what may seem like a little issue in the grand scheme of things can be a very big issue in someone's life, as you know, because we work with you on these constituent issues. So thank you. Great to be with you, and Kibbitzing with Kagan.
Kibbitzing with Kagan. All good. All right. Stay well, Chris. I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
You too. Bye-bye.